You're watching Roundtable. It is now a two-horse race in France, and while Macron and Le Pen may not be vying for the Prix de Triomphe, their prize is arguably greater. We are now into the final furlong in the Elysee Palace Stakes. So what will it mean for the rest of Europe, for the wider world too, if it is either another 5 years for Macron or a first term for Marine Le Pen? Very good to have you with us. I'm David Foster. On the 24th of April, the centrist Macron will face the right-wing Le Pen in the second round of the French presidential election. As the polls predicted, it will be a repeat of their 2017 runoff, which leaves the left-leaning voters a tough decision to make, whether or not to give their vote to a far-right populist or to a pro-business liberal who's been branded as the president of the rich. Well, beside the predicament that France will be in, what do the results of the election mean for the future of the European Union, for NATO? And does Marine Le Pen have a secret plan for Frexit? In coming days, it will be crucial for Brussels, Washington, and NATO whether Paris will remain committed to the European project and stay on side against Putin's war in Ukraine. Mr. Macron has promised to, as he put it, implement the project of progress of French and European openness and independence, while Le Pen has called for France to pull out of NATO's integrated command structure, also to work on revising the EU treaties and to reform the immigration policy. All of this if she wins the election. Let's begin the discussion. Go to the south of France, first of all, and there we see Alexis Poulin. We welcome him back, journalist and co-founder of Le Monde, Moderne media, to Vienna, and Velina Tchakarova is their director at the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy, and in the studio, Denis MacShane, former Minister for Europe for the United Kingdom. We are going to speculate here because this programme goes out before we know the result. So let me come to you first of all, Alexis, and say, if it is to be Macron, will it be the same Macron that we've seen for the last 5 years in his dealings with the rest of Europe, the rest of the world indeed, and with France?
It's likely it will be 5 more years of the same Emmanuel Macron. You know, in France, we have these politicians saying that, I have changed, but they don't change. And people tend not to change. And with Macron, now that he's in campaign, you can see that he won't be changing. He said that there will be a few adjustments, that he doesn't want to do 5 more years. But he can't be something else than being himself, being Emmanuel Macron, the way he treated the French, the little words, and also the fact that he's the European champion for France, and he will want to keep that for sure, and maybe go faster because of the Ukrainian war. So if we have 5 more years of Macron, it will be a more dynamic Macron, I guess, and it will be even more faster than the 5 years we had before in terms of changing social system in France and trying to get more of the European Union in the world.
Denis, if you agree with what Alexis is saying, and of course you don't have to,
I don't.
What has Macron been saying to the public that he's necessarily going to have to go back on if he's been trying to sell himself as something different and he turns out not to be?
He's the cautious reformist, and we've seen that in some of his election promises, but everything's changed. I mean, Macron was never created to be a war president. I mean, nobody has been, but it's not his thing at all. He's got to deal with a World War II type war, not that far flying time from France. He no longer has Angela Merkel as the great stable anchor of the European Union. He's got a German chancellor who's at the moment at odds with his other two ruling parties in coalition over how to handle, again, Ukraine. He's got every chance of seeing a Donald Trump return. He's got incredible economic problems, inflation. I mean, I'm old enough, and you're probably not old enough, David, to remember when inflation was a real problem in Britain.
I was offered a pay rise of 23% or the level of inflation, whichever was higher.
I negotiated 25% pay rises for BBC journalists at the time, so maybe I was trying to help you. Macron's grown up in a non-inflationary world. He is facing an aggressive China. Now, I think he will win, but we don't know. But he's going to leave an enormous number of French voters who didn't want him there, who voted for lots of other people in the first round, who will stay at home. And I think France is going to be a much, much more difficult country to govern. I see France, after the Macron victory, pulling on a gilet jaune.
And you're certain it will be a Macron victory?
Look, I've been following Madame Le Pen on the radio. She's talking about pulling headscarves off Muslim women, banning Jews from eating kosher meat. I mean, it's ridiculous stuff. This isn't policy. This is old-fashioned.
But it's populism and it can be attractive. Velina, you think perhaps that French voters are more interested, tell me if I'm right on this, in the cost of living, inflation, the energy crisis, than they are in looking at somebody who's intent on making a name for themselves in the world. And that may mean that they drift towards Marine Le Pen.
Well, I think that actually Macron will win because of the fact that voters would root for predictability. I think that Le Pen is very much counting on foreign policy agenda rather than the real issues at home. And I think that this is going to be the real trigger for voters in France to actually go for predictability instead of actually voting for someone with an unknown agenda. And populists right now are not so really popular in Europe, to be honest.
Would they be going for the devil they know simply because it's been suggested that Marine Le Pen's economic policies are untested, even though she's offering no income tax for the under 30s, she's offering to cut VAT, etc., which all might seem quite attractive to the voters?
What I foresee is that the voters will go for predictability coming from the center rather than from far right or far left positions. And in terms of energy crisis, which was actually ongoing already in last year and has been amplified now by the war against Ukraine, in terms of food crisis, surging prices of commodities, I think that Macron is going to be the winning formula for voters for really practical reasons rather than actually, counting on a populist candidate. I think that this is going to be the winning card for Macron. The very fact that he's a rather centrist candidate than one coming from extreme spectrum of the political
Okay, let's speculate about what they might do and what it might mean. Right now, this is from a former Europe minister for Germany. We must all rally behind Emmanuel Macron. It's either him or the downfall of a united Europe. It sounds a bit dramatic, but that's the way it is. Alexis, with their relationships being very different in the way they address Brussels and European problems, what would it mean if Le Pen won the presidency for France's relationship with the European Union?
I mean, Marine Le Pen has changed to start with. She is not talking about Brexit, for example, and she doesn't want to leave the euro, which was the case 5 years ago. She wanted to go back to franc rather than euro. So she knows that France needs the EU to some extent. But what will change is the relationship with Brussels and with the different states in Europe, because clearly Marine Le Pen has shown a lot of support and tried to get support from Viktor Orban from Hungary, for example. She also praised the Polish government, and everybody in France knows that she was close to the Russian Putin and some Russian banks. So she is more prone to go to illiberal regimes, as we call them, rather than to talk with the sort of German, French or allies, as we call them in the Europe construction. So she will change the way Europe is actually moving. Rather than further integration, she would go back to a Europe of nations and with a sort of redistribution of power between the nations in Europe.
She also wants to leave the NATO military command, which was something France did back in the 1960s, came back in again, I think, under Sarkozy, which doesn't mean leaving NATO, but means having more control of your military forces. How would that change the North Atlantic Treaty?
That would change a lot, of course, because France got a big army and also nuclear weapons. So we are key in the NATO overall architecture. But we were not part of the Allied Command until Nicolas Sarkozy. So it's kind of getting back to normal, if you want. Of course, France wouldn't leave NATO, and France still got a lot of ties with the American administration and, of course, the American market, because it's all about the gas. It's all about economic power. It's what we do if we cut the Russian gas and how we manage to get the European economy starting again. And that Marine Le Pen wouldn't change that, I think, because she said that since the war in Ukraine, she condemned Putin action in Ukraine and said that it was unacceptable, even what is happening now in Donbass. So she's aligned to the overall NATO line in this Ukraine conflict.
Denis is shaking his head. Say what you will on that, but then I've got a question about the king, if you like, or the queen of Europe, who might be in charge, if you like, of the European Union, if it's either Macron or Le Pen.
Well, very simply, I can't accept Alex's rather Dr. Panglossian point of view about Marine Le Pen.
Or will be okay in the best of all possible worlds.
Exactly.
Yes.
She has said she will stop all arms supply to Ukraine. That is a stab in the back for the Ukrainians. Everybody in France knows that she is Vladimir Putin's best girlfriend in the world. And there's a lot of anger in France over that. That's why I think she's going to lose the election. Secondly, on Europe,
can we just add something more to that, which is about energy supplies from Russia? Would she then be unwilling to put pressure on Germany to end it?
It's not really a problem for France. France went nuclear in the 1970s. Italy had a referendum in 1987, came out of nuclear. Germany had a mixed energy economy, and then Angela Merkel, for reasons about winning green votes, dropped nuclear. France actually is okay. Its energy supplies are balanced. I don't think that's much of a story. But on Europe, she is saying, for example, she will unilaterally reduce VAT to 5%. That is illegal in the European Union. She is saying that jobs and social housing will first go to French citizens. That is discrimination in favour of white French citizens. That is illegal. What she's actually offering as a programme would mean she has to leave the EU. I agree she's dropped the word Frexit, though the only foreign leader she's praised in any of her speeches was Boris Johnson because he took Britain out of Europe. But all her concrete policies just would explode the European Union in a set of crises, and if she really tried to force them through, France would have to join Britain outside.
Velina, I'm going to play something from Macron on the very subject we're talking about.
I could have told you here about the plan to leave Europe, that the far-right advocates when it calls for a divorce between Germany and France, an exit from the European Council, a military alliance with Russia, and not a word for the African continent on the other side of the sea, and so defeat them on April 24.
Alors battez-les le 24 avril.
Is she really in cahoots with Vladimir Putin?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And we should consider a possible victory. As I said, I do not count on such, but we are now in the area of speculations. If she wins, this would be a Trump's moment for Europe. This would mean bilateral agreements instead of institutional approach to Russia or to China, if you like. Probably her first visit will be to Moscow because she's convinced that she can actually agree with Putin on the future of the European security architecture. She, as president, would mean also undermining the European Union and the NATO project from within. Of course, she will not exit the European Union. I mean, she will not make sure that France exits the European Union or NATO, but she will make sure to undermine these institutions the very same way how Trump was doing this during his mandate. And of course, this will mean a very troubling period for the French-German engine of the European integration. And I don't not only mean the enlargement process, I mean also institutional integration,
but can I just ask
is
you
not
this?
going to function.
Velina, though, if her motto is make France great again, and she is as close in the polls as we are led to believe, she has a lot of support. And therefore, the French voters share her suspicions about what is going on to some extent. How will that have to be reflected if Macron gets back into the Elysee Palace?
Well, first and foremost, I do not expect that foreign policy will be really reflected in the choices of the electorate. Once again, foreign policy is usually not on the agenda, but it's going to have really gruesome consequences whether Macron or Le Pen is going to win. And Macron is going to have some tough choices to make after being re-elected, in a sense that he will need to revive the French-German engine of the European integration. He will have to give more impulses to it because the German chancellor is going to go for rather status quo, and the French president will have quite of an ambition program for the future of the European Union as a collective institutional global actor. And what we are going to have, I suppose, witnesses also revival of the relationship with America. And this is, of course, key to France. France has always had a very special relationship with the United States, to put it mildly. And in a sense, Macron will have to reshape this relationship as well, because this war in Ukraine is going to continue. It's not going to be over in 2 weeks or in a month. And this is going to have serious consequences for the old continent. So France, together with Germany, is not going to make it without American help in the long term, financial, economic, and also, I suppose, probably something like a new kind of trade agreement between the European Union and the United States is going to be on the agenda. So this kind of sovereign or autonomous position of Europe, as it is in the French ambition of Macron, different from Le Pen, is going to require also reshaping of the American-French relationship.
I want to explore this because you can hardly say that she's centrist, but she's no longer the polarizing far-right figure. This is for you, Alexis, that she once appeared to be. So she's moved more towards the centre. Macron is not a fan of the liberal left, if you like. He is more of the centre. Are we seeing the end of the extremes in French politics? My point really is,
No.
are they more similar than perhaps we might like to think?
No, they are not. I think, on the contrary, Emmanuel Macron is kind of the ultra center, and he's gathering all from left to right, even in a new government, when you can see he wants a new majority coming from all the existing parties. Marine Le Pen is still far right on the overall game in France, and you have Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is seen as far left, who was third man in the election. So all that.
But Mélenchon has, all he has said is don't vote for Le Pen. He hasn't said vote for Macron.
No, he said not a voice for Marine Le Pen because he's part of this Republican front to some extent. But he didn't say vote for Macron, because a voice for Macron is a voice for Macron, and he's been an opponent to Macron for the full term of Macron. So it's difficult to say to his electorate to vote for Macron. What he's trying to do is position himself for the upcoming election for the National Assembly in France. But if you see what Macron has done is polarized even more the political spectrum in France, and with this main chunk of centrum and the rest being the extreme with more
which is demonstrated in the fact that if she wins the presidency, Marine Le Pen will have very little support in the Assembly itself.
It depends, because when when Macron was elected, for example, a lot of people said he won't be able to have a majority because his party is too new and he has no one to show to the people, and he managed to have a majority. So Marine Le Pen could well do the same trick, even if she's not from the same political spectrum than Emmanuel Macron. It's very weird to have this kind of election where one guy then sort of put the color of the assembly for 5 years. It's sort of the other way around in other countries, but in France it's presidential regime. So that's the way it works.
We're going to hear a little bit from Marine Le Pen, only because in the interests of equality, we've just heard from Emmanuel Macron, but that will lead me on to perhaps France's relationship with outside characters. And this is her talking just a short while ago.
France can be useful in the resolution of the world's great disorders if and only if it is independent. This is a paradox that the globalists misunderstand, but that we nationals know to be an eternal truth. This is one of the reasons that will make me leave the integrated command of NATO.
So there is Marine Le Pen, Dennis, talking about how France would relate to other countries. What about the United Kingdom? What difference is it going to make to a Boris Johnson government, if indeed he is still here in 2 months' time, whether it is Marine Le Pen or whether it is Emmanuel Macron?
I think it'll be hard for any democracy to work with Marine Le Pen. I mean, her views on Muslims, on all these issues we haven't really gone into, are just beyond the pale. Not even Donald Trump was so extreme. Now, I'm really interested in the relationship between France and Britain. That's my cup of tea. It's what I've been working on since I first wrote a biography of François Mitterrand 40 years ago. I'm assuming, forgive me, that Marine Le Pen won't be the president, but then what about Macron and Johnson? These will be the two big players because Olaf Scholz is locked in quite a tricky coalition. And the other gentleman, Mr. Draghi in Italy, Mr. Sanchez in Spain, no disrespect, they're not in that league. Now, the relations between London and Paris in the last year or two, especially in the last year, have been dreadful. The worst in 100 years, say former British ambassadors to Paris. The worst since Waterloo, say former French ambassadors in
Just
London.
over 200 years ago.
Yes. I mean, we can go back to Agincourt and all the rest of it. But the plain fact is it's whipped up by a lot of the very anti-European passions that still run through the Conservative Party. It's not so much the Prime Minister, Mr. Johnson. He can speak some French. But when he says, for example, to President Macron, "Oh, Emmanuel, donnez-nous un break, give us a break." I'm sorry, you as a Prime Minister don't talk to the head of the state.
He was trying to rub him up the wrong way.
But exactly. But believe me, in international relations, taking the Michael, as we say politely in England, and rubbing up other world leaders the wrong way isn't wise. So I just wonder, since they're both intelligent men, Mr. Johnson actually speaks passable French, he learned it in Brussels, might we move to a complete reversal like 120 years ago and create a new entente cordiale, a new amitié cordiale, not about returning to the EU, that's not on the agenda, but finding so many areas in which Britain and France specifically, we're talking about Britain and the EU, Britain and France can work together.
Okay, I get it. Velina, I was interested to see, just because it was so unusual, the president of France unbuttoning his shirt a la Vladimir Putin and showing off his chest hairs right the way across the newspapers this morning. Are we going to see a more demonstrative Macron if indeed it is him? Is he going to try and make himself the bull of Europe?
Well, we cannot blame the French president for being so ambitious when it comes to the European security and defense agenda. We should actually blame the rest of the member states for not being ambitious at all when it comes to the future of the European security and defense agenda. And here I expect that Macron, being re-elected, is going to be more ambitious when it comes not only to French, but also to European interests in, let's say, traditional French areas. And here I expect, for instance, points of intersection, also with the Brits, for instance, when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. I expect that France is going to really start pushing forward the Indo-Pacific agenda of the European Union, and then, of course, France. And I hope that this AUKUS moment is going to be overcome by, let's say, introducing avenues for cooperation with France. Because
okay, that is the Australia, UK, United States defense
exactly,
pact.
Exactly.
Alexis, we don't have very much time. If a week from now you are proven to be either right, that it is Macron, or wrong, that it is Le Pen, are you hopeful in any case that something good can come from France, for France?
Yeah, surely. I mean, it's just a head of state, you know. Look, for example, Britain has got Boris Johnson for a few months and it's still okay. So it works. You can have a head of state and still, you know, have good thing out of it because we got a democracy working. So we'll have a new assembly, we'll have new laws, and we have the French people. And I think problem is that France will be so fractured because Macron and Le Pen only represent a small amount of the French population really behind their policies, that we might go towards a social crisis like a yellow vest or something even deeper because of the Ukrainian war and the price of the energy and all this. So it all depends. It's very uncertain, but let's keep faith.
Plus ça change. Thank you very much indeed, including the weather in the south of France. It looks absolutely wonderful. We can see the reflection, however much you want to hide where you are. Thank you very much indeed, Alexis, Velina. Thank you very much indeed, Denis MacShane. And thank you wherever you're watching this edition of Roundtable. We'll be back and we hope you will be too. Goodbye for now.